The City of London, London's financial district, is a peculiar place. It has been called a city within a city, a state within a state. It is run by an organisation called the City of London Corporation, a private company that performs all the functions of a local council with a private police force and private courts.
Those of you who aren't from the UK, some of you even who are, might not be aware just how weird a thing the little City of London is within the big London. The City of London is a separate entity to the wider London, and it has its own head, the Lord Mayor, who's distinct from the Mayor, who runs the rest of London.
Every November, the city stages the Lord Mayor's Show, the world's oldest civic procession.
The City of London has long had this curious legal status because back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over, the city was one of the only portions of England that he failed to conquer, and he struck a deal with the city in 1067 that allowed them to continue functioning.
To this day, the City of London is exempt from numerous laws that govern the rest of Britain. Its political system derives from the Middle Ages. The city's electorate is dominated not by its residents, but by the private businesses operating within the city. Its Lord Mayor is selected by the heads of medieval guilds.
They have a representative in the House of Commons called the Remembrancer. Apart from the clerks of the House of Commons, he's the only unelected person there.
All other lobbyists have to stop, in the lobby. They're not allowed past the lobby.
The City of London has a permanent representative in the House of Commons, whose role is to report back to the City of London Corporation and to lobby Parliament on behalf of the city.
The Corporation of London, clearly, it's a unique and interesting phenomenon that should have attracted many political scientists, political economists and economists. But I don't know of anyone who has studied systematically the Corporation of London and its impact on policy or economic policy. So we can only surmise. Some people assume or surmise that the Corporation of London is extremely powerful and is able in one way or another to shape British policy, particularly in financial matters.
Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister after the Second World War, had something to say about the City of London Corporation.
He did, So over and over again, we have seen that there is in this country another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad, contrary to that which has been decided by the people.
At the heart of the City of London stands the Bank of England. The Bank of England is not just a central bank, it is also a financial regulator. At the demise of empire, the Bank of England used this regulatory authority to help attract the world's banks to London. In 1972, the Bank of England issued a license to the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which set up its head office in London. Within 10 years, BCCI grew into the 7th largest bank in the world. 10 years later, BCCI was bankrupt.
The Deputy Director of the CIA, Richard Kerr, said late today that the CIA did use BCCI to support CIA activities overseas.
But BCCI had not just collaborated with the world's intelligence services. It had also engaged in extensive financial fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing.
BCCI constituted international global crime of a level that boggles the mind.
BCCI was financing terrorism. The Bank of England knew it, says the report. but instead of supervising it properly, it tried to prevent the bank's collapse.
I am saying very directly that the Bank of England had sufficient information in front of it to close BCCI 15 months earlier than it did. Millions of depositors were hurt in that process.
Numerous whistleblowers from BCCI had contacted the Bank of England, yet the Bank of England did nothing.
The Bank of England had plenty of time to intervene and investigate, but it did not do so because the tradition at that time, which still survives, is that, well, actually, you have to just kind of send hints and talk over lunch tables with the chaps regulating other chaps, and all would be well.
Robin Lee Pemberton, the governor of the Bank of England at the time of the collapse of BCCI, commented, "The present system of supervision has served the community well. If we closed down a bank every time we found an incidence of fraud, you would have rather fewer banks than we do at the moment." London was a place for banks to engage in business that was not allowed elsewhere, where senior bankers did not have to worry about the consequences of their actions. This is one of the reasons why today there are more banks in London than in any other financial centre.
In Britain, nobody goes to jail. No bankers go to jail. They generally don't. They are a protected species. And that is part of the offshore business model of the UK, is to say, we will protect you, we will bring your money here, we will look after you, we're not going to put you in prison, we'll let you do what you want.
Light touch regulation was one way of attracting business to London. Another was secrecy. From the 1960s onwards, City of London institutions began to establish offshore branches in former outposts of the British Empire. Their aim was to create offshore centres with strong secrecy legislation in order to attract capital from across the globe.
Swiss banking secrecy is the most famous, the most well-known. You put your money in a Swiss bank and they promise not to tell anybody, and that's one kind of secrecy. But another kind of secrecy, which is very British, is the trust. And the trust is a very slippery, complicated and devious mechanism. Trusts emerged, the legend has it, from the time of the Crusades, when the knights would go off and fight in foreign lands, and they would leave their assets in the care of trusted stewards.
What trusts do ultimately is they play with the concept of ownership. Ownership is not such a simple thing. So the settlor, the knight in this case, would hand over the assets to someone who these days would be called a trustee. It's often a lawyer. Legally, you are separated from those assets. They're not yours anymore. There's a barrier. You can't be taxed on them. Nobody's going to find anything about your connection to these assets.
In Britain's offshore jurisdictions, no qualifications are necessary to be a trustee. Anyone can set up a trust and act as a trustee. There is no registry of trusts. There are no bodies to certify that a trust has been set up.
The only persons who know about the creation of this agreement are the trustee and the settlor. There's no obligation to register it. There is no financial reporting obligation of trusts. They're not required to put annual statements onto account anywhere. So actually trusts are, to all intents and purposes, invisible arrangements.
Economist John Christensen was an economic advisor to the secrecy jurisdiction of Jersey for 10 years.
We're not talking about a few million. We're talking now about trillions. Trillions of dollars of capital, which apparently belong to nobody. For tax purposes and for other purposes, they belong to nobody. Everything, works of arts, gold bullion, racehorses, cars, real estate, not just financial assets, but a whole load of non-financial assets belong to these trusts, sitting there belonging to nobody. Now think that one through, because we are talking about maybe as much as $50 trillion of assets sitting offshore behind these instruments.
Well, the Cayman Islands are among several British overseas territories who have signed a new information exchange agreement with Britain and the rest of Europe to tackle tax evasion. The countries are now required to automatically provide details of the ownership of bank accounts and how they're used. Cayman became the first signatory last week.
It's important that the Cayman Islands should be recognised as the first overseas territory to sign such an agreement with the United Kingdom. And I think this importantly reflects the constructive approach that the Cayman Islands has taken in delivering our shared objective of rooting out tax evasion.
The trust lies at the core of the British secrecy model. They don't use banking secrecy. The Swiss use banking secrecy. The British, of course, are only too willing to kill off banking secrecy because they will then capture a larger market share. That's why the Brits are doing this.
Trusts are the basic building block of Anglo-Saxon secrecy, and they form the basis from which complex offshore structures are created. Every secrecy jurisdiction offers a specific set of services, from trusts to shell companies to secret bank accounts and nominee directors. The combination of these services into complex structures, spanning multiple jurisdictions, enables the creation of secrecy structures that are almost impossible to penetrate.
An offshore structure will often have a trust kind of sitting at the top of it. The trust will be here managing the assets, kind of controlling the assets. Underneath it, the trust will own some shell companies. Each one might be in a different jurisdiction. So you might have a trust in one jurisdiction whose trustees are somewhere else, whose beneficiaries are somewhere else, which owns offshore companies somewhere else. Each of these companies might then own assets, so that they might own, a bank account, a racehorse, a yacht, a painting, a portfolio of shares or whatever.
There are numerous variations of trusts and offshore secrecy structures. There are offshore lawyers whose work entails the creation of ever more complex and obscure structures. The aim of these structures is to hide the identity of the owners of offshore assets and allow offshore wealth to be recycled back into global markets.
But looking on the amount of money being administrated from tax havens, you see that it is a curve going like this. And all the talking we have been doing along with other wonderful people fighting against tax havens has not changed anything, It is the word where you say, go on talking, you're interesting me, and I'm going on doing what I want to do. We know everything today because we have had the Panama Papers, we have seen it, and we are not able to act upon it. And we are not able to act upon it because this system is really protecting the few people that are having benefit from it. And these are in percentage very few people, but they are powerful. And I see in the Panama committee that I'm sitting in, the only thing that could change this is to have a public accessible register of the beneficial ownership of trusts and of all kinds of companies. It is easy.
The Panama Papers are a collection of leaks from the offshore law firm Mossack Fonseca. Mossack Fonseca is the fourth largest offshore law firm. The other 9 of the 10 largest offshore law firms are registered in British overseas jurisdictions. When countries complain to Britain about the activities run out of its offshore havens, Britain claims that these places are independent and that there is nothing it can do.
I've heard time and time again from officials in Berlin and in Paris and in Washington and in other countries that they've been told by the British government that, yes, they're well aware of what's going on in Jersey and they think it's very unfortunate, but they don't have the powers to intervene. Well, that's a straightforward lie. They do have the powers to intervene. They just choose not to.
Britain plays this kind of game of pretending, when it suits them, to pretend that these places are independent. At the end of the day, Britain appoints the governor, appoints lots of senior people in these places. They're responsible for foreign relations and defence, and also they can veto their legislation as well. So Britain has a massive degree of control. Basically, it is controlling these places, allowing them a little bit of political space.
During his time as economic advisor to Jersey, John Christensen frequently travelled to London for talks with various British government departments.
As economic advisor, I had a lot of contact with different departments. Traditionally, UK governments have tried not to interfere in the domestic affairs of places like Jersey. So it happens in a more subtle sort of way. You kind of go and talk to someone, either at the Home Office or the Treasury, and they'd say, well, I'm not actually particularly keen on this piece of legislation. It might be a good idea if you didn't go down that route. And over a cup of tea, that's quite a strong signal. That's a signal, go back to the island and say, they don't want you to do this.
The British government prefers not to interfere overtly. Instead, it communicates its desires through informal discussions. There is no paper trail or official statement. Discussions take place behind closed doors.
The relationship that these places have with London is very much about the British establishment and people understanding each other. I mean, anybody who is British or knows British people knows that communication between us is often very subtle, and you have to kind of know the codes when people say stuff. I mean, a lot of irony involved and a lot of kind of codified language for the British establishment that people kind of understand how it works. And I think that is very much the case with the British relationship with the tax havens. I think there's a lot of understanding of what we can and can't do without anyone having to actually spell it out.
By keeping its power hidden, Britain is able to claim that these jurisdictions are politically autonomous.
Independence for Cayman is not on government's agenda. That's the message being sent to the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. Attorney Steve McPhail will be representing government at the UN meeting. The committee was set up to help colonies around the world on the road to independence. But Mr. McPhail says he'll be making it clear that Cayman is not ready for that transition.
And that message is that the Premier, his cabinet, his party has no mandate from the people of the Cayman Islands to seek independence. That is the message that I will be carrying.
When the Bahamas declared independence from Britain in 1967, the offshore bankers relocated to the Cayman Islands and continued their business from there. It was the British connection that reassured bankers and their clients that their money was safe.
This British bedrock, that is what has allowed these places to become so trusted by the financial services industry and offshore finance and all these people.
In reality, much of the wealth administered in Britain's offshore havens is controlled from London.
The City of London, by and large, likes to do its really dirty work outside London. There might, heaven forbid, be a regulator who actually takes the job seriously and starts to prosecute them for fraud in London. So better to do the frauds offshore in Gibraltar or Jersey, where there's much less risk that a serious prosecution will ever happen.
Deals are often discussed and concluded in London, but then registered offshore for tax, transparency, and regulatory purposes.
What they allow the city to do is to get involved in dirty business, but then when the scandal hits, to say, well, they're kind of independent, there's nothing we can do about those places, that's not us, that's tax haven activity, and we're the city, you know, we're not involved in that kind of stuff. So it's an incredibly kind of convenient relationship.
The City of London has shaped the way in which Jersey, Guernsey, and the British Overseas Territories have developed as tax havens. I see these places as the Frankensteins created by the City of London.
Today, the UK is the world's largest provider of international financial services.
The UK has an almost unique role in global finance. If you look at data, the kind of data that we've constructed in the Financial Secrecy Index, you can see the relative shares of each country in the global provision of financial services exports. That's financial services to non-residents. Now, there are two big centres and everything else is quite small in comparison.
The two large centres are the United States, with around 19% of the global market, and the United Kingdom and its offshore jurisdictions, which have around 25% of the global market.
And if you add to that other jurisdictions, ex-colonies, but recently independent, fairly recently, by which I mean Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe even Dubai and Bahrain, and Cyprus, then you reach a figure of nearly 40%. And I think that figure represents better the position of London in the global financial market.
The soldiers left, the administrators left all the colonies, but they still kept a significant degree of control over the financial flows from these the former parts of empire in the rest of the world. So you could describe it as a second empire, Britain's second empire, sort of hidden financial empire spanning large parts of the globe.